The agenda this week talked politics and sexism with former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard, evaluated the quality of the condo boom in Ontario's capital city, and mapped the problem of genetic discrimination. The agenda's Week in Review begins with a very different view of the new U.S. president from conservative thinker David Frum. I must say, I can't recall the last time that a magazine article got as much buzz as the one that you have just done. And for those who may not yet have read it, let's read an excerpt here to get us off to the races. Donald Trump, you write, represents something much more radical. A president who plausibly owes his office, at least in part, to a clandestine intervention by a hostile foreign intelligence service, who uses the bully pulpit to target individual critics, who creates blind trusts that are not blind, invites his children to commingle private and public business, and somehow gets the unhappy members of his own political party either to endorse his choices or shrug them off. If this were happening in Honduras, we'd know what to call it. It's happening here instead, and so we are baffled. David, some people are observing that not even a month into Trump's presidency, you are already suggesting that America is turning into a banana republic, and they wonder whether or not you're a little quick off the trigger to come to this conclusion. What say you?
Well, the important things that we need to know about Donald Trump are not things that might happen in the future. They're things that have already happened in the past, things both at home and abroad. I'll admit the single thing that alarms me most is that Donald Trump has opened a question whether, he said this during the campaign, whether he might or might not honor the NATO treaty and protect the NATO allies covered by Article 5, the one that commits the United States and Canada to, and all the other NATO members, each to the protection of the other. We already know that there will not be financial disclosure of any kind. That the tax returns, which every president, beginning with Jimmy Carter, has voluntarily disclosed. Gerald Ford disclosed a large part of his returns. Carter disclosed all of them, every president since. That's not going to happen. The legally required White House disclosure forms, I filled them out, are not very informative. And of course, the Trump Organization is not a public company. We don't know what's going on. But the Trump family itself has told us that they are hugely dependent on influxes of money from Russian investors. The relationship between Trump and the Russians is extremely disturbing. And we all saw that footage of Donald Trump at his June press conference, his last press conference before the election, inviting Russia to hack Hillary Clinton's emails and publish them for the world.
Let's talk about the media. He has already declared, and so has his spokesperson, that the media are in essence, the official opposition in Washington now, and they intend to be treated that way. How do you believe that Donald Trump can harm the media?
Well, one of the things we need to understand that the media no longer means Reuters, the New York Times, the Financial Times, those familiar brands. The most important media company in America is Facebook. That's where people get their information from. Twitter is one of the top 5. And these new companies, which often lack a sense of themselves as media organizations, are tremendously susceptible to pressure. Let me just give you one example from Twitter, the president's favorite medium. Shortly before the election, about a week before, Twitter canceled a number of accounts belonging to one or another white supremacist. By the way, I don't know that this was a wise thing to do, and I wrote a column at the time criticizing it, but Twitter did it, and it was clearly Twitter's right to do it. It's a private platform. There's no First Amendment claim against Twitter. I spoke to somebody who was very intimately involved with the Trump Organization at the time, and they were outraged. And they talked very menacingly about bringing antitrust actions to bear against Twitter should they win the election. After Donald Trump won, he convened a meeting of tech executives. Twitter was pointedly excluded from the meeting, although it was the president's favorite platform. And around that same time, Twitter reinstated all of those accounts, not only reinstated them, but verified them. Now, if President Trump were to say to the Washington Post, hey, you have a pro-me columnist, you just fired him, I demand you reinstate him on penalty of punishment, we would see what that was. But Twitter is a publisher just as much as the Washington Post is. And everyone who has an account there is a columnist, and Twitter has the right to close our accounts. The president pressured them, apparently, into reopening them. There are other, so when you think about the kinds of pressures that are brought to bear against the media, you have to think about this in 21st century way. And I know this is too long an answer, but let me say one more thing about this. One of the things that the risk really of getting wrong in understanding the Trump presidency is we look back to the 1930s and 40s for examples of what authoritarianism will look like. But we live in a different world. It's not going to look like that. It's not going to function like that. And you have to be alert to the signs of how it would function in the 21st century, not in the middle of the last century.
And your article does that in The Atlantic, and therefore let's play it forward. If the scenario you described today is merely the thin edge of the wedge and it gets worse for media in the United States and beyond, what does that look like?
Well, what it doesn't look like a police state. You know, I don't think it will ever be true that Donald Trump will be able to say to the FBI, go arrest that person because I don't like them. The FBI won't do it. And if the FBI, in some extraordinarily difficult to imagine situation, did it, that person would get before a court, and the courts would let the person go, and the court order would be obeyed. There isn't enough time in a presidency to change the courts to that degree. But what Donald Trump can do, and what he has done, and what his wife has also done, is they can, on their Twitter accounts, point to somebody whom they don't like by name and flood that person's life with death threats. Now, it's not the police, it's not the state. The person still has to leave their home, though. That happened to the head of the Carrier Union local in Indiana. It's happened to journalists who have covered Donald Trump. Some of them have given up journalism altogether because of the flow of death threats.
Perhaps it struck such a serious chord because, and we'll put this information up here, last October, the Inter-Parliamentary Union released a report looking at sexism that female parliamentarians face. They spoke to 55 female politicians from 39 different countries. Here we go, Sheldon, let's put these up. More than 80% of respondents said they were affected by psychological violence during their parliamentary term. More than 65% said they had faced humiliating sexual or sexist remarks. More than 40% said they had experienced, quote, extremely humiliating or sexually charged images of themselves spread through social media. One European parliamentarian reported receiving more than 500 threats of rape on Twitter over a 4-day period. More than 44% said they received threats of death, rape, beatings, or abductions. How much of any of that did you have to deal with during your political career?
Well, kind of all of it. Certainly on my social media feeds there would be, not every day, but regularly, threats of violence, threats of rape, shocking sexist, misogynist statements. And I think that is something that women politicians live with. I think one of the things that social media has done is it's sort of taken the cork out of the bottle, things that people might have thought but been too inhibited to say. With the anonymity of social media, they think that they can just, put it out there. Now, that's a bad thing in the sense that, the violence and the imagery is there, but maybe it's forcing us to confront the fact that those views are held about women leaders, and I'd rather openly debate it and resolve it and get to a stage that women are treated equally as political leaders than have it sort of lurking in the background unnamed.
Is that why you have not shut down your Twitter account?
No, I have a Twitter account and, mostly people are generous and engaged, but certainly there are these aspects for women. And I think, there's plenty of research now about the way in which women's leadership is received by people in the community. And I think if we're frank, we all have some sexist stereotypes whispering at the back of our brains. And we, those stereotypes whisper to us that a woman who is, commanding and controlling, a leader, we easily conclude, look, she can't be very nurturing, she can't be very empathetic, she's probably not very likeable. And once people conclude those sorts of things, then it seems to be easier to lash out. And I think, in the US presidential campaign, we saw a lot of this playing out. The image that Hillary Clinton had to overcome was an image that she wasn't likeable. Well, why did people have that image? I think Hillary Clinton's an eminently likeable person. I think a lot of it's got to do with gender.
Is this the new normal?
Well,
in an era of Trump, I have to add.
Well, I hope it's a contemporary stage where we're having the debate we need to have to get to a world where female leaders are truly treated equally and people don't focus on their appearance, don't focus on their family structures, don't engage in this sort of gender stereotyping and just judge them well or badly based on how they do their job as a politician, whether they make good decisions or bad decisions.
I guess it's been almost 25 years since Canada got its first and still only female Prime Minister. No social media back then, so that was one thing Kim Campbell didn't have to worry about. Today, we've got Angela Merkel, of course, in Germany. We've got Theresa May in the United Kingdom, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, Michelle Bachelet in Chile. Do female leaders today have it, well, I don't know, a little easier than you insofar as you were kind of the first very high-profile female head of government kind of when social media began to explode. So do you have it tougher than these leaders do today?
Oh, I wouldn't say tougher. And I think a lot depends on, context. I mean, I was involved in some incredibly hard debates about things like putting a price on carbon and combating climate change. And the, sexist jibes became part of that hard political debate. So I think the circumstances in which you're pursuing your leadership matter. But there are some things that are common for all female leaders. This focus on appearance, this sense that they're probably pretty hard-boiled, not very likeable, that we need to work on right around the world to get a more equal future.
Here in the province of Ontario, we have Kathleen Wynne as the Premier, who is the first female Premier in Ontario history. That's going back nearly 150 years. She's also openly gay, and I can tell you, as a guy who spends too much time professionally on social media, some of the filth out there and some of the extraordinarily obscene language I see used about her is really beyond the pale. But the question is now, what do we do about that? You can't shut Twitter down. You can't shut Facebook down. So what do we do?
Well, I think there's increasingly movements for change. So to really deal with the problem, firstly, you've got to shine a light on it, and discussions like this are shining the light that we need to have. And then you need really activism to change attitudes.
What kinds of complaints, as a lawyer, do you tend to hear then?
Well, nobody gets what they were sold. In other words, the marketing is terrific. The arrival, not quite as good.
Those posters and those,
Yeah,
and those sales
telling you,
booklets are gorgeous, aren't they?
Those renderings and all those plans and all those flowers and coffee are wonderful. But the reality is, as Christopher said, everybody is so busy. The complete finish and the quality of the finish is not what people thought they were going to get when they were in that sales office.
Do they understand the notion of an upskilling gap that we were referring to earlier?
Yeah, I think probably it's more problematic, excuse me, even at the higher end of the market. Because at the higher end of the market, people really feel that they're going to get things in a certain way, and there's a real measure of disappointment. Toronto has a huge investment component in its condominium corporations. They are probably not as fussy about the finishes. So there's a finishes issue in the way it's done, and there's also the requirement that purchasers move into the buildings before they're really finished. That also creates a level of discomfort and anxiety for people.
Sure. Chief Planner, I want to read some of your words back to you. We have been in a catch-22 for quite some time of being very reactive and, in fact, letting the development industry set the standard. You said that a couple of years ago. Who's setting the standards 2 years later?
Well, it's important not to take that quote out of context.
That's what we do. That's what we do in journalism.
It is what you do. It is what you do, and I'm going to call you out on it. Well, there's two different pieces here, and one is around the planning side and the built form side and where we're putting new growth, and the other, which we're talking about today, is around the quality of the development, which is regulated by the building code. And I do think that we've been back on our heels in terms of being in a situation where the industry has been driving the market. In some ways, that's a good thing because we've had an aggressive industry right at the moment where we've needed to build as much housing as possible, going again to that supply and demand challenge that we see. The demand is simply far exceeding anyone's expectations. So on the planning side, I think one of our challenges is that whereas we were bullish with respect to the kind of growth we expected to see right in the core of the city, we still underestimated. And in light of what's happening south of the border, the interest we're seeing in our city right now, I can tell you in the past 2 months has gone through the roof. So again, we've had a global event that is transforming the positioning of the City of Toronto and is even further going to significantly increase demand. So again, we're back on our heels going, wait a minute, we thought things were hot a year ago. I can tell you a year from now, it's just escalating. And so on the planning side, that's one issue. On the other side, and this does relate to the labor market, you get a fussier consumer that is going to be more sensitive to the alignment between the renderings and what they purchase when you have oversupply. When you have less supply, you have a consumer who's actually more desperate to get into their housing.
And not so fussy.
And not as fussy. I do think that there is a challenge here in terms of building up a more sophisticated buyer in the condo market that can actually read through that understands the rendering and can hold the development industry more accountable. I also think there's a regulatory role. This is something that we complain about a lot. I don't tweet out very many renderings that developers produce because often we see through them. We know that those are not an accurate representation of what that building is going to look like, and that's a problem.
Who's setting the standards in your view, Paul? 2 years after Chief Planner Keesmaat uttered that thing that had to be held into context, or whatever the expression is there. Put it into context.
Well, from my perspective, I think in light of some of the incidents that have happened, as you mentioned with falling glass and some of the complaints which have happened even with respect to water leakage incidents in condos, the building code has really evolved, and there have been new supplementary standards which have been developed to address some of these issues. So the building code is actually an ever-evolving document, and it works with industry and the pace of construction to try and keep up with different technologies and new construction methods which are coming to the marketplace.
I think also there's an overall maturity that's happening within the industry, and that happens throughout all aspects of it. So the building code, yes, is continuously being looked at and updated to ensure that buildings are better built and construction is better. The planning department is having a better understanding of exactly what these buildings are going to be like when they're finished. The construction industry is understanding these buildings better.
People have been studying prostate cancer for a long time. And some people get prostate cancer and it advances quickly and they die relatively fast. Could be 6, 8 months, 18 months. Other people, like my dad, have it for 20 years. And they've been looking.
They don't die of it.
They die of something else usually, or it finally gets them if their heart is really good. The reality is that researchers have been looking at the different cancers. And last summer it was discovered that, and it's not 100%, but a large number of men who have rapid onset or quickly metastasizing prostate cancer have a different gene than the men who don't have it. So if I'm a physician and a patient and we're in a discussion about what kind of treatment we should have, should it be a more radical treatment or a more slower treatment, having that genetic information can help the patient and the doctor get the right course. It's not 100% predictive. And this is the other problem, is that the genetic information that we're getting is not absolutely predictive. What it is it's one of the tools in the toolkit for smart physicians, smart clinicians to help a patient.
So it's indicative, but not necessarily predictive.
Exactly. And we don't want to overstate the case. Like if someone finds out they have the BRCA1 gene, they're not absolutely...
BRCA, breast cancer.
Breast cancer gene. They're not absolutely going to get breast cancer. They may have a higher likelihood of getting it, but there are other factors, cross-genetic factors, there are lifestyle factors, there's environmental factors, and we're worried that someone could assume that because someone has a genetic predisposition, they could use it against them, and they're no more likely than someone else to get the disease because of the other factors.
Andre, I'm going to get you to follow up. Do these tests cause unnecessary worries in your view?
Well, they can cause unnecessary worry. I think we just, you ask people if they had been tested. So I did 23andMe. I would do a full genome test in a heartbeat if I could afford it. When it comes under $1,000, I might do it. And the reason is because I think there's much more promise than there is peril. I think there's good elements to this bill, but the worst thing about it to me is it perpetuates this fear that this evil genome stuff is out there and we're all going to be, classified by our genes and discriminated against. And I don't think that's the reality. The reality is we have all kinds of discrimination in society, using the true sense of the word, making distinctions, nowhere more so than in the insurance industry. And this is just another tool. So I hope that people won't be scared off by the notion that insurers are discriminating against them, because they already are. And they're going to be able to do so in a more precise fashion. So I think there's more benefit than harm.
Do you see a Gattaca-like future here if Rob Oliphant gets his way?
Well, it's actually before Rob has gotten his way. We've already identified that 40% of the population that we've surveyed in our work have identified the fact that they've experienced at least one form of genetic discrimination.
So this is a thing.
Oh yeah, it's not a myth. It's not only a theoretical concern. It very much is a pervasive, widespread phenomenal
Among
issue.
the general population?
The population.
Not just in a subset that may have Huntington's.
That's right. So within that subset is specifically the survey results that we've studied. Now, what we've also been able to do is compare that research to very similar type countries which have the same or similar type of healthcare system, like Australia, that have done very similar work with a broader range of their population that found very similar estimates and occurrences of discrimination across life insurance, long-term disability, just like we have, in terms of insurers actually denying applicants life insurance or long-term disability outright, or charging them exorbitant rates, and in fact pressuring them to undergo genetic testing in order to qualify for insurance. And this goes beyond insurance, as the bill does aptly. This is, as Rob has indicated, issue of adoption, courts, custody and access to assisted living housing for families.
Well, let me follow up on that with Rob, because, and Andre just mentioned it a second ago. We do, insurance companies discriminate every day. I mean, they're in that business. They discriminate on the basis of gender, on the basis of how much you weigh, on the basis of how tall you are, on the basis of whether your grandfather, your parents had, these kinds of illnesses that they worry about. So why shouldn't they be able to use genetic information as well?
What we worry about is they're using information that they don't really understand. And that this is such new science, this is such an emerging field, that a little bit of information can actually cause wrong decisions. I actually agree with Andre. I actually agree. We don't want people to be afraid. We want them to embrace this information. It'll help them. But it's complex, and it needs to be walked through very carefully. It's not just about their ethnic makeup. This is quite important information. It could lead to lifestyle changes or improvements, or it could indicate a treatment option that would be more advantageous, but people should not be afraid.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety. They're on tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and now, thanks to our nightly Twitter live stream, on our Periscope page at periscope.tv/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.